Feminism today has become a toothless movement.
Unpaid labor, unseen labor, mental load. Those are all things that fourth wave feminism is really trying to bring awareness to.
Should men be able to make decisions about a woman's body? Great question.
And I choose to use inclusive language. I feel the term pregnant person is fairly self-explanatory.
Are we also talking about pregnant dads? Like, who are we talking about?
I really don't see why we have to have a semantic conversation.
Well, when we're talking about feminism and uplifting women, I think it's wildly degrading.
That was Bronte Remsik and Isabel Brown discussing feminism and its relevance in today's modern world.
Thousands came together
Women, men, and
for the pro-life movement
of reproductive rights.
Bronte is a family medicine resident who shares her passion for social justice on her large social media platform on TikTok.
Historically, women have been told, if you don't want to be a stay-at-home mom, if you don't want to dedicate your entire life and being to your children and family, then you are wrong and you're going to be unhappy.
Isabel Brown, host of the Isabel Brown Show, is a conservative contributor who has worked for Turning Point USA and is an author of her new book, The End of the Alphabet: How Gen Z Can Save America.
But ultimately, it comes down to a singular question. Is this human being? There is no such thing as the gender pay gap. And if there were, why wouldn't every company in the United States only be hiring women?
So we're reading different studies and living in different realities, it seems.
We
But
claim to live in the most progressive society in human history where you can do whatever you want and there are no consequences to your actions, yet we're devoiding society of purpose.
I shockingly would disagree with that. Deviating from this idea that motherhood and wifehood are the key identifiers of a woman, that is what devoids women of purpose.
Wow, lots of follow-up questions to that.
How do you feel about abortion exceptions in the case of rape?
I'm very glad we're talking about this.
It's a really interesting hill to stand
Are
on.
we fighting an unnecessary battle, or is the current wave of feminism necessary for women's rights and equality?
Last year, more than 1 million children were aborted in the United
That's
States.
also 1 million people who decided that it's safer to not be pregnant.
Welcome to the Ellen Fisher Podcast. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. As we wrap up season 2, I want to take a moment to thank each and every one of you for joining me on this journey. It's truly been an incredible season filled with meaningful conversations that sometimes left me in tears, life-changing knowledge to integrate into our daily lives, and plenty of healthy discourse and debate on some of the most polarizing topics of our time. I couldn't have done it without you, so truly thank you for being here. I'm going to be taking a much-needed break to spend more time with my family. If you watched the episode with Suzanne Venker on 30-something women having an identity crisis, then you know where I'm coming from on this, and I'm very excited for this break. This is our final episode of season 2, so sit back, relax, and let's dive into one last memorable opposing views discussion together. And it's a really good one, you guys. Stay tuned for updates on what's coming next for season 3 by hitting the subscribe button and the notification bell. And until then, thank you for being part of this community. Welcome to the Ellen Fisher Podcast. Thank you so much, guys, for being here. I am so looking forward to this conversation, and I have a bunch of really hot topic questions to get into. But before I do that, I wanted you guys to share a little bit about your story and what led you to being passionate about this topic. I'll ask you first.
Yeah, so right now I'm a physician, but when my content started and I started being a lot more vocal about feminism, women's rights, kind of that whole sphere, it started because of the Texas SB 8, which was the 6-week abortion ban. And I woke up one day as a med student at the time and just like really frustrated and really angry about it. And TikTok is the place that people go to vent those kinds of opinions. And so I just was like, you know what, I have an opinion and I have to say something. And it was a good outlet. And that video went viral and I was not expecting it to at all because I didn't have a platform at all. And so then I kind of just fed off of comments and interaction. And I was like, well, I have opinions if y'all want to hear them. And so then it kind of just snowballed. And now I'm really passionate about being as good as an advocate as I can be.
Awesome. My name is Isabel Brown. I am a full-time content creator and I host a live stream every day where we talk about a whole host of issues, not just women's related topics and conversations, but what's going on TikTok, politics, religion, dating, the whole nine. And I never expected that this would be something I did for a career. I too actually was pre-med way back in the day and have a few degrees in biomedical sciences. In graduate school, more on the public policy side of things, working in Washington, and sort of found myself thrust into the world of digital advocacy in the midst of what we often call a culture war in America, with this idea of seeking truth and asking other people to seek it for themselves and be courageous enough to share it in a world where truth itself is often not defined. I've really been leaning into women's related issues in the last few years or so because I'm seeing what I am deeming to be a real war on women in postmodern America, where women are constantly under attack, not just our lifestyle and what makes us unique and beautiful, but even the very idea of womanhood can't be defined in our society today. And you're watching that really negatively impact the next generation of women in profound ways for our mental health, for our stability of meaning and purpose in our lives, in our success trajectory in America moving into the future. So we spend a lot of time talking about marriage. I just got married at the end of June. We spend a lot of time talking about parenting because that's sort of the phase of life that we're thinking about next. And I'm really watching this cultural revolution happen with young women right now to break down barriers of political divide and differences, of all of the things that threaten to tear us apart, to instead ask how we can build a better future for all of us moving forward.
Okay. And what does feminism mean to you guys? And do you identify as a feminist?
Oh, great question. Today, honestly, no, I wouldn't identify as a feminist because while historically I think feminism has had incredible pillars to this movement of advocating for women, elevating us to true equality in society, and giving us an even playing field to be successful in whatever way we deem, athletically, in our jobs, academically, etc. Feminism today, in my opinion, has become honestly a toothless movement that doesn't know what it's advocating for and often actually is undermining women in the process. It's why you're watching women become so controversial in and of itself. We have a Supreme Court justice in the United States who can't answer the question, what is a woman? You're watching women's rights advocates claim that the best trajectory for women moving into the future is in fact disintegrating what we would understand womanhood to historically be. Heck, you're even watching feminist movements applaud men taking over women's spaces and calling it inclusivity in society rather than what it is, which is just frankly misogyny. So I wouldn't necessarily identify with the postmodern fourth wave feminist movement we find ourselves in today, but feminism historically has done amazing work for women and truly brought us to the even playing field of equality that we get to live in every day as the status quo.
Okay, what about you?
So I would absolutely identify as a feminist. And for me, feminism is about equal rights. It's about equal opportunity. And when you talk about fourth wave feminism, I specifically appreciate and would identify with fourth wave feminism because I think it's essential to recognize that we are three white privileged women sitting here having this conversation. And a really big part of fourth wave feminism is the recognition of intersectionality. And so, sure, there might not be legal barriers to opportunities to us now, but there are still very much different prejudices and stigmas against women, especially when it comes to being working moms and things like that. And when it comes to, again, different identities, when it comes to women of color, women in poverty, it's recognizing that they also need to be supported and they also need to be seen. And when it comes to things like our unpaid labor and unseen labor and mental load, those are all things that fourth wave feminism is really trying to bring awareness to because it's so much easier to ignore.
What do you think about that?
That's an interesting thought. I'd be curious to know how you are seeing these prejudices continue to exist against women. If in fact they're not legally, structurally in place in America today, how are those manifesting from your point of view?
Yeah, so things like the gender wage gap. So women are still earning less than men with the same degrees, with the same positions. Women also get questioned more often when they try to balance work and parenthood. Things like that. When it comes to just the opportunity to do what you want to do with your life, you want to have the same opportunities as men, both financially and from the perspective of just like the societal appearance of what you're choosing, where men have a lot more freedom to not be constrained by gender norms when it comes to their life choices. If they don't want children or they don't want to be married, a lot of people don't question that. A lot of people are just like, yeah, that makes sense, you know? But when a woman chooses that, there's a lot of that sort of stigma behind it of like, oh, well, surely like you'll change your mind. Surely that's what everyone would want. And so that's what I mean when I say there's that stigma and there's that pressure pushing against women who want to go outside the traditional gender norms of what we would think women should want for ourselves.
That's so interesting because truthfully, I encounter the exact opposite in spending my time online or on college campuses or with women's organizations. If anything, I think our postmodern society has built a very strong stigma against traditional gender norms. You look at every headline in Cosmopolitan magazine, for example, encouraging women to not have children, to not get married, to be as promiscuous as possible responsible and never to be committed in their personal dating relationships. The Surgeon General of the United States of America a few weeks ago actually issued an official declaration that parenting is theoretically hazardous for your health because it might make you more lonely than if you never had children to begin with, which was an odd train of thought to begin with and not incredibly logical. So you're watching the establishment media, you're watching establishment healthcare and physicians, you're watching college campuses, your favorite celebrities, Hollywood, influencers, all strategically peddle this narrative for women that the only way to be an empowered, enlightened woman in 2024 is to abandon tradition, to abandon gender norms, to abandon femininity in many ways, and certainly to never get married or have children. So that is interesting that there is that tug of war still in America, but I certainly think today gender norms are what the stigma happens to be rather than buffing gender norms. But it's interesting you bring up the gender wage gap. This is a conversation we've had for years and years and years in the United States, and certainly historically has been true decades and decades and decades ago. But there have been countless studies proving that the gender pay gap does not exist when you account for different career choices, working full-time versus part-time. The census data that typically accounts for this 84 cents on the dollar or 84% figure even goes so far as to skew the numbers that teachers, first primary and secondary teachers who are overwhelmingly 3/4 female, who work 38 weeks out of the year, they do the math that they work 52 weeks out of the year to make it seem like they're earning substantially less money than men. But that all is obviously not true, has been proven to be wrong over and over again. And interestingly, is statistically dramatically changing, because when you look at the careers women are choosing in the norms of 2024, let's look at medicine, for example. You're a physician, a first-year resident. Historically, in the 1960s, only 8% of med students were females. Today, over 50% of medical students are females, and physicians are statistically the highest paid consistent employment in the United States today.
Yeah, so I've actually read the complete opposite studies. From the studies that I've read, specifically when people, men and women, are in the same role, so a managerial role or a supervising role, women make less than men in the exact same roles. Same with people who have advanced degrees, so masters or doctorates. Women who have the same degrees as men will statistically make less money than men with those same degrees. So we're reading different studies and living in different realities, it seems. But I want to really go back to what you were saying about the media and everyone pushing women to not get married and not have children and demonizing this sense of tradition. And to be clear, I'm pro-choice in all different ways. And I believe when I see the media pushing these things, I don't see it demonizing the traditional way of life. I don't see it demonizing people who want to homeschool or who want to be stay-at-home moms. I see it as them opening the, opportunities for women to choose what they want to do, because historically women have been told that if you don't want to be a stay-at-home mom, if you don't want to dedicate your entire life and being to your children and family, then you are wrong and you're going to be unhappy. And so now the media is kind of swinging that pendulum, which, like, admittedly, pendulums swing a little bit too far before they normalize, right? And I'm not saying I have anything wrong with it, but I think that what the media and what people are really trying to portray is that you do not have to fall into this historical role. You can date around, you can choose to not get married, you can choose to not have kids, and all of those things are valid. And for the longest part of history, women were seeing the exact opposite messaging. We're encouraged to, marry whoever and have kids because that's what makes you happy. And a lot of our grandmothers and mothers were like, oh, guess what? It didn't make me happy. And they're encouraging the younger generation to make whatever choices make them happy.
That's an interesting perspective, namely because statistically, even today, married women with children are overwhelmingly self-reporting themselves to be the happiest in society. We're overcorrecting in so many ways for maybe potentially flawed narratives of the past or incomplete narratives of the past, which we call a pendulum shift, but honestly looks a whole lot more like propaganda to me when we're inventing realities that don't reflect indicative in normal society. The Family Stability Society, I can't remember the exact group that ran this study, but from 2023 found that 40% of women who are married with children self-report their lives to be incredibly overwhelmingly happy. Only 22% of unmarried women with children feel the exact same way. So it's not really manifesting in society the exact same way that we're seeing overwhelmingly portrayed in these headlines, in movies and TV shows, in studies conducted by academia and what's said by presidential candidates of the United States. So it seems to me this isn't so much of a societal pendulum shift as it is an overwhelming narrative that is being pushed onto the next generation to convince them, hey, I know this is what's being proven in society. This is probably what's going to make you happy. Just because that's how we've done things in the past, we can never consider that moving into the future because we have to be progressive for the sake of being progressive.
Trust me, we can all use a little support when it comes to staying on top of our nutrition with busy lives, children, and the sometimes seemingly never-ending to-do list. Along with eating a whole foods plant-based diet to help me feel my best, I am obsessed with Anima Mundi's beautiful selection of products. Founded by herbalist Adriana Ayales, Anima Mundi is an apothecary which uses over 200 different sustainably grown herbs from around the world to create intentional products that contain zero fillers, binders, or flow agents. Made in the US with certified organic, wild-crafted, and sustainably harvested plants and herbs in a vegan and gluten-free kitchen. They also use eco-friendly packaging in recyclable glass or biodegradable bags. I love the spirulina, which is an organic protein-rich mineralizer that tastes delicious in banana mango smoothies. And the butterfly pea powder, which you can add to your favorite tea, lemonade, favorite meal, or even your bath or face mask for health promoting and healing properties. I got a discount code for you guys. Enter the code LMFisher20 for 20% off. Click the link in my show notes below.
See, and I think that we're reading different statistics because, again, I've read many statistics that show that typically mothers and people who give birth are more likely to suffer from mental health conditions than women who do not, because it is more of a stressor. There's all of that unpaid work, unpaid labor, and unseen mental load that women have to carry. And we also have to look at the way that these surveys are asked, because a lot of times the questions that are asked in a certain way that want to get a certain answer from you. But I think, again, when you see progression and you see progressive ideas, you see it as people pushing that idea as the only correct way, where I just view it differently. I see it as opening up opportunities for people and recognizing that all of these different ways of life are valid. And again, through history, like historically, women have been given these very narrow options and told, and when we talk about propaganda, right? I see that as propaganda. I see it as propaganda to say that you will not be happy unless you have a family and children, because for a lot of people, that is not true. And that's also not necessarily a choice. If you don't meet the right person or you get stuck with the wrong person,
Absolutely.
it doesn't necessarily mean that you are going to be happy. And so many of our mothers and grandmothers have told us, this did not make me happy. It wasn't the marriage itself, it was the person. So ensure that you are, aiming for an equal partnership, and, make sure that you are choosing your partner wisely, because women have not been given that opportunity. Women have not been, encouraged to really make those intentional choices. It's always been about checking a box instead of living life intentionally.
Yeah, and look, I think the spectrum of human happiness obviously is a subjective conversation to have. It depends on the individual. It certainly depends on one's circumstances. I hope joy is something people continue to choose no matter what their circumstances are, but that speaks more largely to the mental health of our population. What I do have a problem with is not the expectation that people can make different decisions for their life based on their individual circumstances or their own personal autonomy. It's this idea that the narrative we are being pushed every single day by the machine, whatever you want to call that, government, healthcare, media, and everything in between, seems to be overwhelmingly convincing you in whatever way, shape, or form that what we understand to be traditionalism is wrong, that marriage is wrong. In fact, having children is wrong. We're sitting here in Los Angeles filming. The Los Angeles Times a few weeks ago had a headline saying you are an inherently selfish person if you want to have a child. And they were making this claim through the lens of climate change. But I can't tell you how many headlines I see every single day with statistics and data and evidence from the experts that you are a bad person if you want to get married, if you want to have children, if you want to go through this journey of traditionalism that we often scorn at in postmodern society because it's viewed as the opposite of progressivism, when in reality, that's just not making people happy. We're in the midst of the biggest mental health crisis of all time in Western society, certainly within the context of Gen Z. And for the first time ever, young women are actually struggling with more mental health conditions than young men. They are statistically much more likely to be anxious, to be depressed. The CDC found that in 2021, 1 in 3 teenage girls girls seriously contemplated taking her own life. And it's so hard for me to wrestle with this idea that we claim to live in the most progressive society in human history where anything is possible and you can do whatever you want and there are no consequences to your actions and you can make your life brick by brick exactly what you want it to be. Yet we're devoiding society of purpose and meaning and fulfillment entirely, which is why we end up feeling so lost now.
All right, you go ahead and reply, and then I have another question for you guys.
Yeah. So I actually disagree that we're devoid of purpose, because I think the entire purpose of deviating from this idea that motherhood and wifehood are the key identifiers of a woman, I feel like that is what devoids women of purpose. And this idea that you can achieve whatever you want and you can be whatever you want, is the intention of that is to help women find their purpose, because so many people had to put their dreams and desires aside to lift up the men in their life. And now we're saying, no, we want the opportunity and we want to find our own purpose. And that doesn't always have to be motherhood and wifehood.
Okay, there was a lot there. I feel like there's so many things I wanted to ask within you guys going back and forth. But real quick, going back to the gender pay gap, have any of these studies that either of you read, had anything to do with a woman who might be less likely to ask for a raise than a man? I've read something about that. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked. So the Harvard Business Review actually did a study where they found that women who requested a higher or an increase in their wages were seen as less likable and more aggressive than men at the same companies asking for the same thing. And they were therefore less likely to be granted that pay increase and less likely to be given promotions. And so you can see in that culture how women would then be discouraged from asking, because then you're seen as less likable and it's going to create more hostility in the workplace, which is unpleasant. And so that's reducing women's opportunities for growth.
What are your thoughts on that?
I just think it's not quite indicative of what we're seeing with patterns in society today. Women are statistically much more likely to seek out a college degree today. They are overwhelmingly the majority of college students and graduates. Women are twice as likely, according to some studies, to be hired for the same job as men, and twice as likely to be promoted for the same job as men within the same company, depending on which studies you're looking at. So the problem with statistics and evidence is that it doesn't really tell the whole picture, right? And I think that's exactly what we're seeing with this idea of the gender pay gap. You can certainly find a company that might be paying their female employees less than men, which would be a horrible practice, but that's not accounting for the general societal trends of women taking more time off of work because they're having children and embracing maternity leave. Maybe they leave their job for a few years and end up coming back. They might work in a job, as I mentioned earlier, like a teacher that doesn't work 52 weeks out of the year. So if you're dividing their annual salary of 38 weeks by 52 weeks, of course that's going to look abhorrently low. When in reality, mathematicians and economists have proven over and over and over again, when you account for job of choice, when you account for educational field of choice historically, which is dramatically changing today in the 2020s, and when you account for potential time off from maternity leave or taking a sabbatical from work, there is no such thing as the gender pay gap. And if there were, why wouldn't every company in the United States only be hiring women? If we live in this evil capitalistic society where these evil bosses want to make so much more money and withhold that from their employees, which I hear all the time, why wouldn't we only be hiring women to save companies and CEOs that much more money in the process?
Yeah, what do you think of that? That's an interesting perspective.
Yeah. And again, we're reading completely different studies.
Yeah, you're
because
just going back and forth.
Yeah.
And we don't have like a specific study to bring
Which is a
forth.
problem in and of itself, right? I often say in 2024 America, we're living in two different Americas, and we're watching society really rip in half between one reality and another reality, often along the lines of red states and blue states. I think it's inarguable that that's the reality we live in, but that's the problem with our society being devoid of objective truth, right? It's why I do what I do every day. When we lack an objective standard for what is real and what is not, because my truth is different from your truth in society, all of a sudden anything is true. Anything can be proven, anything has data and statistics behind it, and we lack the opportunity to have real meaningful conversations about what's best for humanity.
Yeah. And I do want to say too, when you mention things like teachers, it is true that when we look at a broad scope of women's careers versus men's careers, especially historically, women do, again, they're pushed into it. And so now we have more opportunity, but women were typically secretaries, nurses, teachers, and fields that were female dominated were underpaid and continue to be underpaid because they're female dominated. There's a principle called male flight, that when more women enter into a career field, men leave, and then the wages for that position tend to either stagnate, they don't continue to increase as inflation in the years increase, or they decrease because women are now in those positions. And so we have to account for, like you said, maternity leave. We have to account for all these things. So when we're looking at the gender pay gap, there are statistics that show equal degrees, equal positions, they're paid differently, but also from a more broader societal perspective, women have found themselves in positions that are compensated less because they're seen as lesser than.
Okay, so I want to go to this topic of purpose, women, freedom of choice. You mentioned something about women not finding their purpose to be motherhood or being wives, but I have a feeling, at least from my own lived experience, that motherhood and being married to my husband is the most important thing I've ever done. Far more valuable being a mother than this podcast. Let's just be real. I love this podcast, but it's nowhere near compares to being a mother. So I imagine people listening who are mothers, I would think people might want to discuss this together about that based on something you brought up. So why don't you elaborate a little more on that and then you can respond.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, this is all about choice. Yes. I think that the whole point is realizing that both choices are valid and everything is going to be different for every woman because we're so unique and we're so individual, and motherhood and being a wife can be incredibly fulfilling, which is why I'm pro-choice in all ways of life, because I don't think that it is my ability. I don't think that it is my responsibility or that I even have the ability to say what will make you happy or what will make you happy, which is why we should all have equal opportunity and respect everyone's choices to do either, to be a traditional wife and mother, to do a little bit of the in-between, or to be a full-on career woman. I think all of those are valid for different women.
You mentioned earlier something that stuck with me, that embracing marriage or motherhood in the past for our mothers and grandmothers was elevating the men in their life rather than putting themselves first. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So typically women were encouraged to stay home, take care of the house, take care of the kids, while their husband, the father of their children, went after their dreams. They went after the promotions. They dedicated their life to work and whatever their passion was and whatever their purpose was. And so women's jobs weren't necessarily to discover what their purpose and their passions are. If it happened to be outside of motherhood and wifehood, it was instead to be like, we'll just encourage him to do what he needs to do, and you pick up all the pieces while he's out there.
Do you think that's still true today, that marriage is inherently elevating men or motherhood is inherently elevating men?
Yeah, absolutely. And there are statistics that show that even when women and men in the same households are working the same amount of hours, they're both full-time working parents, men or women will be more likely to be in charge of the kids' schedules, do all of the housework, and have more of that mental load of the household. So even when in our modern society where really economically a lot of us can't be single income, we have to be dual income, a lot of that load still lands on the woman, and there's a domestic labor gap.
I think that follows with what young women are being told today, that marriage and motherhood is never something that you should pursue because it's going to be a mental load on you. It's going to bring stress and hardship and negativity to your life, which obviously manifests in the trends that we're seeing societally. We have the lowest marriage rate right now since we began recording marriage rates in 1867, and we hit an all-time low in the last 100 years fertility rate in 2020, to the point that we can't even replace our own existing population. So clearly, this narrative that's being told to young women is overwhelmingly convincing that you are going to be miserable when you tie the knot and spend the rest of your life with one individual. That's echoed through every single headline and viral social media video that we see at the exact same time. And even more so, the life is going to be sucked out of you if you bring more life into the world. But that's been proven to be the opposite over and over and over again through every generation. The overwhelmingly happiest people in society who self-report the most purpose, the most meaning, the most fulfillment in their life are mothers and wives. So how do you reconcile the difference between that?
Yeah, again, depends on the studies that you look at. And I recognize you continue to use this word never. Women are told that they should never get married and never have children. And I push back on that because I disagree. Again, I think the idea is encouraging choice, encouraging intentional choice. Is this really the person you want to be with? Is this someone you can see as a partner? Is being a mother something that you couldn't imagine your life without? Women are not being told to never do those things. We're being told.
Well,
to
they
do
are
them.
quite frequently, actually. Not by you, perhaps, but by many, many people in society, many of the most influential people in society.
Well, it depends on who you listen to and how you intake that information, because I don't hear them saying never. I hear them saying make those intentional choices. You should never end up with somebody who's going to take you for granted. You should never end up with somebody who expects you to pick up the pieces of their life while you let yours fall apart. Those are the narratives. You should never end up with the wrong person. Choose the wrong person if you have the ability to do otherwise. And when you mention, people not having kids and not getting married, it's because they're not finding the right people. And we're making sure that people are making more intentional choices. And I think that's a kind of humorous connection to me, is while women are being told that we should be choosing better partners and making more intentional choices, that leads to us being like, maybe a lot of the men are just not worth committing to.
Well, okay. I'm sure you guys will need to respond to that, but do either of you have a specific study that you can mention that the audience can go and look up themselves and kind of decide for themselves? Either of you have like a specific one you can bring up by chance?
Related
to the happiness of women if they choose
Yeah.
career over
I
motherhood.
have one pulled up right here,
if
actually.
either of you have one.
I don't have my phone next to me, but the Pew Research Center, when I talk about things like mental load, domestic labor gaps, the Pew Research Center has multiple surveys that have shown that when they survey mothers and fathers, and I say this because I feel like these statistics lead to people's discontentment or happiness, right? Like when you talk about things like your everyday life, the tasks that are necessary in your everyday life, those are the things that are really going to impact your overall happiness, is how your everyday life is functioning. And so when we study and when we survey people, mothers say 77% of mothers say that they are the ones who are primarily responsible for their child's schedules and their child's needs, where only 7% of men say the same. And then when you survey couples as a total, only 30% of couples say they have an equal division of household labor. So 70% of American couples do not have an equal division of labor within their household. And I really feel like that reflects how people's happiness can be affected, whether or not you're in a marriage or you have kids, and how the totality of your household is going to function.
The study I referenced earlier, about 40% of married women with children being overwhelmingly happy in their life versus 22% of unmarried childless women, is from the General Social Survey. That's the data from 2022, which is the most recently available. But The Atlantic also ran very similar studies in 2020 and 2021 in the midst of the pandemic, proving the exact same thing. There are other studies that have proven women with the best intimacy lives, sex lives, are statistically religious married women with children. So there are infinite examples out there, but that's just one. But I think this speaks to a larger trend, I think, in how purpose and fulfillment are being packaged to people, not just women, in 2024 postmodern America. We talk about the burden of raising someone, the burden of managing someone's schedule or lifestyle if they are your child, that all of the 76% of women have to do this and very few men have to do this. The problem I'm noticing with postmodern feminism packaged to pretty much everything in our lives, pregnancy, giving birth, raising children, being married in a beautiful relationship for the rest of your life, is that we are packaging everything in a way that is oriented towards me, 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 me. I deserve less stress. I deserve general less mental load in my life. I deserve XYZ. And ultimately, I think we are building brick by brick a very selfish society in the process. It's why we're constantly self-conscious, self-obsessed, self-absorbed, and frankly, really struggling with the internal questions of anxiety and depression, of substance abuse, of suicidation, which is far too normal today among young women. When in reality, we should be asking the question, what can I do for my society? That it is a blessing to give your time to someone else. It's a blessing to serve your family, to raise the next generation of children. That's not to say there aren't hardships associated with that, but we've convinced several generations of people in this country that the only thing that should come first is your immediate want today, which ultimately, over decades and a lifetime, has proven to be incredibly devoid of purpose and meaning over time.
Yeah, and I shockingly would disagree with that. I feel like there's not necessarily anything wrong with being selfish when it comes to your own life. Like, listen, this is what I want to do. This is what makes me happy. And I think that for the longest time, women were told that their needs should be put to the side to prioritize others, whether it be their families, their children, their husbands, whatever. And so now, you know what? If women don't want to dedicate their entire being to other people, I have no problem with that. That isn't, again, to say some people should. I personally love hosting. I love cooking. I'm married. I plan to have kids. Like, I have all these opinions while falling more generally into a traditional structure. But I recognize that that gives a lot of people stress. That gives a lot of people anxiety to host and to have that responsibility and for all of that to land on them. That doesn't make people happy, which is why kind of the summary of this entire conversation is really about choice, right? It's really about ensuring that people are making the choices that are best for them. And I don't agree with the narrative that you should never do this and you will never be happy if you dedicate your being to other people. And I think there is a lot to say about being nurturing, whether it be towards, it doesn't have to be towards children and men. It can be towards your friendships. Women have very, very deep connections with other women. We have very rich social lives, especially statistically compared to men. And I feel like we know what it is to pour our time and energy into people, but it's about whether that is recognized and appreciated. That's where it becomes whether or not it brings you happiness or brings you stress. And you talk about women being more depressed and more anxious. And I think there's a lot of societal factors, especially when it comes to the war on women's rights. I think that that is something essential to recognize, that women aren't just depressed and anxious because we're choosing to be single and child free. Like, a lot of us are depressed and anxious because our rights and our mere existence is being questioned of whether or not we should be able to have autonomy over our bodies, both medically, but also professionally, and whether or not we're able to make choices, because it feels very paternalistic to tell women that, like, oh, well, these are the things that will make you happy, when that's not going to be true for every woman. You have to make them, allow them to choose.
I've been using Symbiotica supplements and incorporating them into my daily routine for the last 6 months, and it feels so good to nourish my body with high quality supplement formulas that work. I started taking Symbiotica because honestly, everyone is coming to the table with something they need to supplement, coming from different health backgrounds and our soil depleted ecosystem. Symbiotica fills those gaps. Since taking their products, I've noticed improved energy and focus, and my skin is glowing. And Symbiotica supplements are formulated with the highest quality ingredients out there. Their formulas don't have any seed oils, preservatives, toxins, artificial additives, or even natural flavors. The liposomal glutathione in particular promotes gut health, enhanced energy metabolism, and contains powerful antioxidant properties that combat premature aging. Most supplements often taste sulfuric or chalky, but not these supplements. These formulas taste delicious. Simply squeeze contents of the pouch into your mouth or stir into your favorite beverage. I'm also absolutely in love with taking their mineral Shilajit in the morning, which contains 84 plus minerals that promote healthy DNA and bodily functions and improves brain function. Feel more energized, alert, and balanced with high quality supplements that work. Head over to symbiotica.com and use the code ELLEN for 20% off plus free shipping on your subscription order. I'll say it again, I am absolutely obsessed with Indigo Luna. Their clothing is what I reach for almost every single day. I'm wearing them right now if you're watching on YouTube. Indigo Luna isn't just another clothing brand. They're on a mission to reduce unnecessary impact on our planet and its inhabitants, all while providing a meaningful alternative to mass production and fast fashion. Their garments are designed to honor the diverse and ever-evolving female form, embracing all women and providing a sense of safety and empowerment. Made from recycled and organic materials, each piece boasts earthy colors and simple, beautiful shapes. But what truly sets Indigo Luna apart is their commitment to sustainability at every step of the production process. From small, purposeful production runs to ensuring fair and safe working conditions for every individual involved, they prioritize people and the planet above all else. Click the link in my show notes for 10% off Indigo Luna. Okay, I definitely want to get into women's rights and abortion, but really quick, I'm going to chime in a little bit just as a mother myself. I do think that you're right in the sense that today's society expecting women to both be the caretaker and work is extremely stressful on women. And I think sometimes, potentially, let me know your thoughts on this, that when women are told that motherhood is not purposeful and that it's not the most enriching thing that you're going to have in your life and that you should pursue a career, that maybe that could be the stress imbalance of like expecting women to both be mothers and have a career, and that maybe it's okay for this season in life for women to have this role of I'm going to rear the children, which it's such a mindset thing, right? Like we're going back to the mindset of like, is men up like pursuing their dreams and careers more meaningful, or is raising children more meaningful? Like as myself, as the woman that I am, I would definitely say raising my children would be more meaningful. So I wonder your thoughts on that potentially this stress could be because of this expectation that women are supposed to produce at the same levels of men. I recently had on Suzanne Benker on my podcast and just broke down in tears with her validating that it's okay to just want to be a mom.
Yeah.
And so that thought. And then we'll move on to these other topics.
Yeah, absolutely. And it absolutely is okay to just be a mom, because mothers are the absolute backbone of our society. They do the most unpaid and unseen labor. And I think when it comes to choosing motherhood, a lot of women have been told that it is all sunshine and rainbows. And I think there has to be that recognition that motherhood is extremely rewarding, but also extremely hard, which is why we need to be choosing our partners appropriately. We need to have societal systems in place that allow women to, take that chapter of life and dedicate it to their children. Is there, paid maternity leave? Is there affordable childcare for when you just need that day off? Is there the opportunities and the support structure available for women who want to be mothers and dedicate themselves to that and still maintain their sanity and themselves at the same time?
I love that we're all kind of saying the same thing here, because interestingly, I would agree with all of that. I am a huge proponent of paid family leave. I think it's abhorrent that we are the only major developed country in the world without a substantial paid family leave law on the books. And I do find it interesting, at the vice presidential debate a few weeks ago, both candidates very strongly advocated for paid family leave, which was very cool. Same with making childcare more affordable, allowing that village to participate, because motherhood is a beautiful journey. It's something that our society should be celebrating and uplifting and rewarding because of how uniquely special it is for society. But interestingly, I never see the reverse celebration from the left. When you hear individuals and people who might not necessarily identify as postmodern feminists today celebrate motherhood, it's never mutually exclusive from also having a career and ambitions and starting your own business or hosting a podcast. Both are usually celebrated in tandem in most of the circles that I run in. But on the contrary, I often see motherhood demonized. I see pregnancy demonized. I see marriage demonized by individuals who are trying to get young women to believe that the only thing fulfilling to your life and to your identity is in fact your career. And we call that feminism today, and that's often echoed in the loudest voices in society. But I wish there were more conversations like this allowing for the nuance to exist, because they're not mutually exclusive.
Yeah, and I think bringing back to this topic of speaking to the past generation that said, look, we've been there, done that. We stayed at home and like it was not that fulfilling. It's the mindset of what you haven't experienced, the grass is always greener thing. And I think that's why society is always going to be doing that pendulum swing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it is, again, about appreciation and recognition, because I think for our mothers and grandmothers who were like, you know what, I did that and I didn't find it fulfilling. A lot of it wasn't the work that wasn't fulfilling. It was the fact that the people in their lives and society as a whole didn't value the work that they did. And that's why they were like, you know what, why did I dedicate my entire being to this when I didn't recognize, I didn't get that appreciation, I didn't feel valued for the work that I did. And I think overall, when you look back on your life, that's how you can sort of have that regret behind it.
Yeah. Okay, so let's get into abortion and women's rights. Who should go first?
Jump in. You brought it up, so let's talk about it.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's a large topic. Is there anything specifically you want me to start with?
Just why you're pro-choice.
Why I'm pro-choice? Well, so because no specific individual choice is right for every person. And when it comes to pregnancy, there are so many factors, from the cause of pregnancy, the experience of pregnancy, the experience of labor, and then parenthood, which those are all separate topics, but obviously interconnected and related. And so I think that a lot of people there's a lot of nuance when it comes to why and how people get pregnant, how people endure that pregnancy, the risks and benefits of it, and then the afterward, the child that's created from it. And again, motherhood is not for everybody. Going through pregnancy is not for everybody. And that is a very sensitive and individual choice that everyone should be able to make, because I believe, especially as a physician, that you are the foremost expert about your body and your life, and nobody else can make that choice for you.
And why are you pro-life?
I am unapologetically pro-life, so this will be a very fun conversation, I'm sure. Namely because I believe in objective truth, and science and logic and reason all work together to tell us that an unborn child from the moment of conception is a genetically unique human being who has never existed before and will never exist again. And because that is a human being in an enlightened progressive society, should be a recipient of the same dignity, human rights, worth, and appreciation and protection as any other person in our society. Now, of course, there's a lot of nuance to this conversation, and I think there's a lot of misconception and misinformation out there about what women's rights are or reproductive health care, and I'm excited to get into some of this. But ultimately, it comes down to a singular question, I guess, and a follow-up. Is this what we're talking about, a human being, a unique human being that is worthy of our protection and dignity? And if the answer is yes, overwhelmingly scientifically, then what do we need to do about it in an enlightened society to ensure equal human rights and prevent what has been, since the 1970s, the greatest genocide against a singular group of people in human history? There are more than 60 million children who have been killed in the wake of Roe v. Wade being decided in 1973. 1/3 of my generation, Gen Z, is not here today solely because of abortion alone. These are potential wives and husbands later on, doctors, firefighters, politicians, scientists, the next great inventor. And we've embraced this dehumanization campaign from powerful individuals in society to gaslight and convince us that this is somehow life-saving reproductive rights for women, when in reality it's the intentional destruction of human life.
So I find it very interesting that you want to recognize the unique individuality and inherent right to protection for fetuses. And the question is not whether or not they are unique human individuals. That is not in question. That is an objective truth. But
Okay, that's great.
in order for you to protect and value the life of a fetus, you have to actively be indifferent to the life and rights of the woman carrying it and
Really?
the person carrying it. Yes, because you say, oh, these fetuses that were aborted, right? They could have been the next astronaut. They could have been a firefighter. They could have discovered the cure for cancer. But do you recognize that women and pregnant people have every opportunity to do those same things, and an unplanned, unwanted pregnancy could likely prohibit them and limit their opportunity to be that world changer? They have every opportunity and every likelihood to be just as successful and world changing as those fetuses. But the difference is they're here, they're living, they're autonomous, they're people who have their own bodies, their own thoughts, their loved ones, their friends and families. And again, to protect and prioritize a fetus's right to inhabit a woman's and person's body, you have to actively be indifferent to that person and see them as only an incubator ready to birth the next generation of world changers, instead of recognizing that the world changers are already here.
Wow, lots of follow-up questions to that. You mentioned that it's not in question at all that an unborn child is a human being, a unique human being. You said that at the forefront, but then you said the real people in this conversation are women, pregnant women who are mothers. So are they both people in this conversation? I think it is, in fact, in question in our society whether the personhood of an unborn child is solidified scientifically. It's not in any way, shape, or form. 96% of PhD level biologists, according to Princeton University, would all affirm in a recent study that children are unique individuals. They are life beginning at conception. And those were overwhelmingly pro-abortion, atheistic, left-wing professors that were asserting that reality. So scientifically, I don't think it's under question. But societally, we see terms like clumps of cells, we see the term like tissue. So there is this dehumanizing language happening. It's not in question that this is a person that we're talking about in the womb.
So that is also sort of the difference as well. And it's very nuanced, right? And you're free to have whatever opinion you like when it comes to your comfort or discomfort level on abortion. I'm not telling you that you should be comfortable with abortion. I'm saying that it should be left up to the individual. I just want to make that clear. And it's all about, so I say it is a unique human individual,
Mm-hmm.
but they do not have personhood. Being a person and being a human don't necessarily have to be the same thing. And
What's the difference?
Well, the difference is that you are not born yet. You are not autonomous. You have not gained personhood by entering into the world and breathing that first breath. And we also, I just want to recognize, we do grant fetuses the same exact rights that every living human being on earth has. We grant them the same rights.
In what way?
Because you, as a living individual, are not allowed to use someone else's body against their will. And if you wanted to do so, you would be criminalized for that. And so we are granting fetuses the exact same rights that everybody else here has, and that is to have autonomy, right? And if you do not have autonomy, meaning your body is not biologically autonomous, it cannot run its own biological systems without relying and potentially harming another individual, then you do not have the right to infringe on somebody else's body in order to sustain your own life.
Isn't that exactly what abortion is? Infringing on someone else's body in order to theoretically sustain your own life? I mean, I find it hard to believe they have the exact same rights as every other person in society when last year more than 1 million children were aborted in the United States, the highest in a decade, highest level in a decade. You don't see 1 million individuals being victims of homicide on the street in the United States. I certainly hope we never get to that reality, but you can't legally take the life of another human being, a genetically unique human person. We can argue about personhood later on, in any other circumstance than this one. So it is a unique under law circumstance in the United States today.
No, that's actually incorrect, because you can in self-defense. You can end somebody's
Self-defense.
Yeah, because
Okay.
that is what it is. Ultimately, you are defending yourself. You are defending your body. You are defending yourself against physical, emotional harm. Also, are you aware of the leading cause of death for pregnant people in the United States?
Women, moms.
Whatever terminology you want to use, I use more inclusive language, but I don't pressure you to do the same.
I just don't understand what pregnant people is referring to. Are we talking about women? Pregnant women?
People who are pregnant. I think it's in the name.
So women who are pregnant. Are we?
I mean, again,
I'm just trying to understand the terminology we're talking about here.
Right. And I choose to use inclusive language. I feel the term pregnant person is fairly self-explanatory. It is a person who is pregnant. You are free to use the term mother if that brings you joy. I don't pressure you to use the term pregnant people, but I do think that it's strange that I have to clarify what a pregnant person is.
I just think it's a new direction in society. If we're talking about the leading cause of death for pregnant moms in society, I'm assuming you're going to say it's homicide. A recent study just came out to say that. Are we also talking about pregnant dads? Like who are we talking about here?
Pregnant people.
So men who are pregnant.
Pregnant people. I really don't see why we have to have a semantic conversation.
Well, when we're talking about feminism and uplifting women, I think it's wildly degrading to women to suggest that one of the most beautiful, powerful experiences we have, growing and nurturing and sustaining human life, which is unique to womanhood, is now all of a sudden co-opted by men.
I don't believe that it's co-opted. I think using inclusive language is to include everyone. A pregnant mother, a person who identifies as a woman and who is a pregnant woman, can still be called a pregnant woman. But when I am talking about society, when I am talking about a group as a whole, I choose to use inclusive language. And I would like to get off of the semantic argument because I think it derails the actual question, which is the leading cause of death for pregnant people is domestic violence. And so when you bring up, oh, well, 1 million fetuses or 1 million babies have been aborted, that's also 1 million people who have chosen something about their body and about their lives. There are 1 million people who decided that it was better, safer, whatever the circumstance was, for them to not be pregnant anymore. And I also want to recognize that over half of people who get abortions are already mothers. They already have children. They're already trying to prioritize the families that they have. So there's this kind of demonization that happens when it comes to centering the fetus and centering the pregnancies rather than centering the pregnant person. And that's why I say you cannot have compassion, or maybe that's an incorrect statement. You cannot prioritize the needs of a fetus without obstructing the rights of the pregnant person and being indifferent to their experience and their suffering and their opinion over their own body.
I do want to come back to that in who's being prioritized in this circumstance and having compassion for pregnant women, but I don't think it's a semantic argument to discuss who we are talking about when we're talking about pregnancy, health, reproductive health care, et cetera, in the United States today. I mean, you're a board certified physician, and you're telling me men can get pregnant in the United States today.
People who are born biologically female have a uterus, but recognize that through society, they identify as male through gender norms. They are able to get pregnant, even though externally they may present themselves as a man, but they have a uterus. They are absolutely able to get pregnant.
So females.
Yeah, females and women. I mean, so again, this is a semantic argument.
I
So
don't think it is, because
biology
honestly,
and
we're watching the biological conversation of this twist and turn every single day with greater intensity and greater confusion for the average population. In fact, I get asked when I speak to kids groups all the time by little boys if they are one day going to grow up and get pregnant later on in their life, because this is what they're being strategically taught
I think that
in their
speaks to our
sex ed classes.
education
It does.
system.
It does. It absolutely does. And you know who is writing most of the sex ed curriculum? The vast majority of it in America today is Planned Parenthood. So there is an interesting conversation here about pregnancy and who it pertains to and where that applies, because what has always been looked at, as we just said a few minutes ago, as this empowering, fulfilling, beautiful experience of motherhood is something we should be celebrating and protecting and making as safe as possible in the United States today, all of a sudden is attempting to strategically remove women from the process. It's why in clinical medical settings today, they often don't refer to mothers as mothers. They refer to them as birthing people. Breastfeeding is being relabeled as chest feeding, which doesn't just incorporate individuals who were born biologically female but identify as males, but instead, as you might be familiar, we are inducing lactation in biological men who otherwise do not have the capacity to ordinarily lactate, to feed their child. I don't know what we would call that. It's certainly not breast milk, but some sort of secretion in order to accommodate for some of this. Heck, there's a conception startup biological tech company up in San Francisco, a few miles from here, called Conception, where women are not even participating in the process of procreation whatsoever. They're growing embryos in laboratories in petri dishes from stem cells rather than using egg cells from a woman. So I don't think this is semantics at all. I think we're taking a uniquely empowering female experience and we are removing strategically women from the process by engaging in what we like to call inclusive language, but in reality is just a lie that it's more than women who get pregnant in America today and have to give birth.
So, and I think, again, it's been clear that we have different perspectives on this information and these rhetorics that we hear, right? Because when you hear pregnant people and you hear this inclusive language, and by the way, inclusive means everyone is included, but you seem to hear it as exclusive, as if you don't say specifically women or mothers, that means we're not included, we're excluded. Where in reality, it's widening the bubble. It's making sure that everyone is included. It's inclusive language, not exclusive.
I don't know. I have a hard time believing a society who can't define what a woman is actually interested in including women. I don't think it is inclusive in any sense, in any way, shape, or form, to call women birthing people, to call them people with a uterus. That's not inclusive. That is exclusive by definition.
I will just touch on that from the medical perspective, because we are trained to use inclusive language when you, one, maybe first meet somebody, or two, you are discussing a patient population as a whole, because you want to include everyone who might be in that patient population. But if somebody recognizes or identifies as a woman, as a mother, and they say, I do breastfeed, you use that terminology because it is their terminology. And at the end of the day, this is all just it's demonizing a minority group. And I think that you don't have to understand it to respect it.
So I do want to get back into abortion, but since we're on the topic of LGBT, a good question to set this up is, how does the topics within the LGBT community affect feminism? Does it affect it positively or negatively? Why don't you go first?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is only a positive thing, again, because we're including more perspectives. And this is why we have to realize the world is not black and white. It is not binary. You know, that is the entire kind of point of the LGBTQIA plus community, is there is not a binary when it comes to gender identity, sexuality, what have you. And so I think the more people we include, the more perspectives that we include and we try to understand or try to respect, I think is only a positive thing for the movement and a positive thing for society. And like I said, you don't have to understand it to respect it. And if it's something that you're like, you know what, that's just something that in my worldview I cannot get past, it's okay. You don't have to, become trans. You don't have to do any of these things. And I think, as I said in the beginning, it's important for us to recognize that we are three, cisgendered white women. And so it's very easy for us who are living in a world that is catering to us and catering to our worldviews and our perspectives and centers us as far as beauty standards, as far as sexuality, as far as everything. We are more or less centered. And then we have to recognize that there's so many more people out there than us, and their perspectives and life experiences are equally as valid and they need to be heard. And that's why things like the LGBTQIA plus community and the protection and emphasis on their existence is important.
Wow. I live in a completely different America than you if you really think that cisgender white women are the hallmark centerpiece of what we would consider to be the norm in society today. Because if anything, rather than the world accommodating for those people are being strategically excluded in the name of inclusivity. And ultimately, biological sex is in fact a binary. It is XX or XY, and very few circumstances of intersex populations, which have been medically discussed for generations at this point. But what we're watching with modern feminism, accommodating for this entire conversation related to the Pride movement, is in fact an erasure of women, and a strategic erasure of women at that. It's what has accommodated for men to be housed in women's prisons, strategically increasing the sexual assault that happens in women's prisons all over Western society. It's what has allowed the Biden administration to rewrite Title IX, which Ruth Bader Ginsburg is rolling over in her grave for, related to actual legalized feminism, to force men to room with women on college campuses in dorm rooms, to allow for men to take women's academic and athletic scholarships, to have men be bunked with women, little girls, on school camping trips and field trips without parental knowledge or consent. We're watching this happen in real time, not just from the legal perspective, but the societal one as well, with men winning Women of the Year competitions and awards, with men winning Miss Universe pageant opportunities, men taking NCAA championship opportunities away from women in multiple sports at this point. Heck, men are often called the best women in society today because they are the most celebrated in our postmodern society. And you see that with influencers like Dylan Mulvaney being celebrated on TikTok, etc. In no way, shape, or form is that feminism. That is the strategic erasure and second-tier status of cisgender biological women to accommodate for individuals who claim that they are women. Now, we can call that inclusivity all we want to feel better about it. We can call that feminism all we want to feel better about it. But it is undeniable in the society we live in the West today, that women are suffering at the hands of accommodating for men who call themselves women. And I just can't in good conscience call that actual feminism. I can't.
So you say it's undeniable, but I will deny that. And I think it's important to recognize that to the privileged, equality seems like oppression. Because when I see transgender people being included, I don't feel that I am being excluded. I don't feel that my identity is being questioned or belittled. That's not how I feel. And I think it just speaks very strongly to our perspectives. I see it as a positive thing for people who have continuously been demonized and stigmatized to be protected and recognized for their existence and their right to exist. And when you say things like, oh, they're allowing men in women's restrooms, they're allowing men to bunk with women on camp trips, whatever, it's inherently that language is demonizing to the trans community because you are making it seem as if these are men who have nefarious intentions and want to invade women's spaces, when in reality, the transgender community, they are at higher risk of violence. They are at higher risk of hate crimes than almost anyone in our society. And so framing it as if it is men trying to, be predatory towards women and invade our spaces is demonizing that group, which actually statistically is more likely to be harmed than to be the aggressor.
Let's put it in simpler language then, to use the language that is more inclusive to all of this. Let's not say men, let's say people with penises. It is a positive to be more inclusive in society when a person with a penis joins the Kappa Kappa Gamma sorority at the University of Wyoming, and there have been numerous complaints to the sorority organization, the university, the Department of Justice, etc., that there is an individual with a penis flashing women in their own sorority house, masturbating on the couch in a women's sorority house because this person with a penis now identifies as a woman. It's a positive thing when a person with a penis is walking around naked in a women's locker room, what we would strategically call sexual harassment to protect women in American history. But now, to accommodate for inclusivity, is just allowing these people to exist. That's a good thing for women's rights and feminism in America today. These are real examples that have happened in the last year. Ask my friend Riley Gaines what the locker room experience was like with Will Thomas, now identifying as Leah Thomas, in NCAA championship swimming. Ask the girls in Kappa Kappa Gamma sorority at the University of Wyoming. These are very real realities that are, in fact, directly harming women, subjecting them to sexual harassment and assault, which we would never be okay with in any sense of historical feminism. But now we're supposed to accept as normal or even celebrate because we're being inclusive?
Yeah, and those are very specific examples that you use to demonize a community.
Oh, there are many more.
What are your thoughts on those examples?
Yeah, so my thoughts on those examples are, number one, the hyperfixation on people's genitalia is very strange to me. I think that their gender identity and their identity as a person is far more important than what might be under their pants. And when we have to recognize that, again, the transgender community is at a far higher risk and they experience violence at a far higher rate than anyone else, typically, or at least people who are born male and people who identify as cisgendered, right? And so, sure, when you have a population of millions of people, there are always going to be examples of people taking advantage. I don't know the details of those specific stories that you recognize, so I'm not saying that they necessarily did anything wrong. I would have to look at the stories themselves. But I think when we have this broad topic and we have this broad conversation about the rights of transgender people and their right to exist and the LGBTQIA community as a whole, and then we hone in on these examples that are only meant to demonize them, when in reality, I have non-binary and trans friends, and they haven't harmed anybody, and all they want to do is be accepted and included. And it breaks my heart and makes me tear up that when we have this conversation, people are questioning their right to exist because of some person at Kappa Kappa Gamma did whatever, when in reality, these people are walking amongst us and living amongst us, and they deserve respect and they're allowed to exist. And not everybody who's transgender is going to be violent, is going to be predatory. And I think we have to move away from this idea that we can only focus on these negative things to paint them as these predatory people when they're not.
Certainly, and there are trans and non-binary people in my life as well. I'm certainly not. I won't say nobody. I'm certainly not questioning anyone's right to exist. I believe this in the context of the abortion conversation as well, which I hope we return to. Every human being has dignity and worth and human rights simply because they are a human being, and no one should be able to take that away from them. But I just find it fascinating that in the conversation of trans and non-binary identity, not once are you seeing society clamor and bend over backwards to erase men's spaces. Perhaps we've done that historically anyway with the demonization of toxic masculinity and anything associated with manhood being bad. But instead, you are watching every single women's space be strategically undermined and taken advantage of to accommodate for the societal trend of allowing for anyone to identify as a woman, to the point that we can't even answer the question, what is a woman. And yes, these predatory behaviors are incredibly normal in prison systems, in hospitals, in education, in athletics, etc. So it's not really honing in on a few specific examples when we're watching society at large bend over backwards to make sure that women aren't women. Women are birthing people, to make sure that we are inducing chest feeding in men rather than helping women breastfeed more appropriately for their children, to make sure men can join sororities, to make sure men can win Miss Universe pageants, to make sure men can win NCAA championships, to make sure men can compete in the women's Olympic sports. There are infinite examples around us every single day to prove that it is women who are suffering far more from this than men are strategically in society.
So it sounds like for you, a big piece for you is like not labeling and assuming LGBT, anyone in that community is going to be predatorial. And it's like the language and the way we're approaching that topic, or not us, but just this topic
Society,
in general. Yeah. Is it fair to say, like what she's saying about potentially going backwards a little bit, that, you know, for example, the camping scenario, would you think that, not obviously, like we're not saying everyone, or she's not saying everyone who is within that community is going to be predatorial, but is it fair to say that the original kind of purpose of feminism was to protect women, biological women, let's say, and girls, that in a scenario like the camping scenario, is it worth it to protect someone's feelings in the LGBT community versus protecting little girls? Like, what is your thoughts on that kind of scenario?
Yeah, absolutely. So when it comes to the camping scenario we'll use, right? So if you have girls' bunks and boys' bunks, and I don't know the ages, I don't know this exact story,
There was a
but
good one in Colorado a few months ago, 5th grade school camping trip at a summer camp, and this ended up happening without parents knowing. So let's use that one.
yeah. So what I see, and this is going to be very individual, right? It's going to be based on the scenario. And I see a 5th grader who was assigned male at birth, but identifies as a female. And in our society, which is why feminism is necessary, women are seen as lesser than. And so if you are born a male and identify as a woman, you are therefore seen as lesser than. And especially in 5th grade, if that person is put into a male bunk, they are more likely to experience violence, harassment, embarrassment, whatever it may be, from their male peers compared to their female peers. And I have nothing but empathy and compassion for that individual, because both choices are hard. And it hurts me to hear these stories, and automatically it's seen as demonizing this 5th grader who finds themselves in an in-between, who finds themselves not belonging to either. And that's somebody that I have compassion for. I don't see them as predatory. I don't see them as trying to invade women's spaces. I see them as trying to find a place for themselves to exist and be valued.
I think you're talking about an example of a counselor, correct?
No, it was students.
Oh,
a more recent one. Yeah.
Okay, for me, I'm picturing a
There was a
counselor.
story in California with a counselor also rooming with underage girls. It was a teacher who was a trans woman, born male, now identifies as female, and parents were never notified that a man with a penis would be sleeping with their daughters in a bunk.
That's a topic I'm like thinking about in regards to that question, in regards to, okay, so protecting a man, an adult person versus children, not saying assuming they're going to be predatorial, but is this part of the in light of the feminist topic of just ensuring protection, and these are girls in regards to like an adult, the feelings of the man or the overall protection of girls, because you just don't know, type thing.
Right.
And that goes for biological men, whether they're trans or not.
Yeah.
Right?
Right. Exactly. And so that's what I think it's so individual. It's based on the person. And I think that parents, and this is hard because, one, I don't think that everyone's genitalia should be advertised. You know, an email shouldn't go out to parents being like, by the way, this person has a penis and they'll be in the bunk. Like, I don't think that that's appropriate. I think that that is, you know, really violating to that person's privacy. But I think that every situation has to be weighed, the pros and cons of it. And at the end of the day, if that person, just for parents' comfort or for the organization's comfort, if they just can't be a camp counselor, I hate that for them. And I don't think that's an appropriate measure, but it's individual. I don't know this person. I don't know the camp. But I think really it's about protecting everyone involved, the kids, the counselors, and everyone just trying to find their place.
Got it. Okay, so I want to get back to abortion, and I have a question for you, Isabel. Should men men who are in positions of government be able to make decisions about a woman's body?
Ooh, great question. I certainly understand where it's coming from because we have this idea that no uterus, no opinion, which actually, funny enough, originated from Friends. I didn't know this, but that statement came from an episode of Friends when Rachel is pregnant and goes into the ER because she's having Braxton Hicks contractions. And everyone says, they're not that bad. And she says, no uterus, no opinion. So interestingly, this conversation came from the origins of pregnancy, not even abortion, which is phenomenally fascinating to me. But there is this expectation that if you're not a woman, then you have no right to have any sort of opinion on the issue of abortion whatsoever. I think that's incredibly shallow. Ultimately, it undercuts the reality of what abortion is, which is a human rights conversation at its very core. I think both sides would argue that it is. One would say it's primarily an issue of women's rights and reproductive rights. One side would say it's an issue of human rights, carte blanche for everybody involved in the situation. But simply because you yourself won't be participating in potentially receiving an abortion in your lifetime doesn't mean you are invalidated from the conversation. So men can absolutely participate in governance over that issue.
What do you think?
Yeah, so I think that there is a difference between having an opinion and putting your opinion into law. So I think that if you don't have a uterus, you're free to have any opinion that you want. I think that when it comes to the medical or the hindrance of accessibility of medical procedures, and when it comes to the opinion about whether or not people with uteruses should be forced to carry a pregnancy, unwanted or otherwise, if you don't have a uterus, you are by and large, and obviously there are nuances to this, but you are by and large coming at it from a inexperienced perspective or from a perspective where that opinion will never impact you. And I think that's where the crux of the conversation is, because you can have whatever opinion as long as it doesn't affect me and my access to medical care and the autonomy I have over my body. And a lot of times, when men specifically will have these opinions and pass these laws, they're passing laws that they will never suffer the repercussions of. So they have less stake in the game, right? And so that's kind of that whole point of no uterus, no opinion, because statistics have proven that women with more children, or the more children women have, they're more likely to be pro-choice because your experience warps or doesn't warp. Your experience impacts your perspective. And so the more children you have, the more pregnancies you endure, the more labors you experience, the more likely that you're going to be like, you know what? This is probably something that people should choose and not be forced into. So I think from that perspective, it's not about opinion, it's about forcing that opinion onto other people.
There are infinite other examples, by the way, of situations where women have been uplifted in society because men have been courageous enough to pass laws to guarantee equality. Title IX is a fantastic example of that. So I do think it's a bit silly to suggest that only one gender should ever have governance over equality over both genders in society, because that's just not the reality that we're living in. But it's also disingenuous to suggest that there are no female lawmakers ensuring the protection of all human life through passing pro-life legislation and signing these laws into effect. This is a very, very nuanced conversation across the binary, both men and women participating in all of it. And, I think it's frustrating that there's this indicative narrative in the abortion conversation that all men are overwhelmingly pro-life and all women are overwhelmingly pro-abortion, because that's just not the reality America is living through today.
Right. And so, one, I want to point out, you say that, oh, men passed laws that granted women's rights. Who took those rights in the first place? You can't be given credit for giving us rights that you took away from us in the first place. You don't get a pat on the back for that. It's just recognizing that they are, begrudgingly promoting equality. They're like, oh yeah, you know what? This is an unequal society that we built and we created, and we have to sort of like recognize that and level the playing field. So that's just number one. But number two, life is not binary. Life is not black and white. Nobody, or at least not most people, are saying that all men are anti-choice and all women are pro-choice. Like, that's not what anybody is saying. Yes, there are women who are anti-choice, but they're in the far minority. Actually, people who are anti-choice are in the minority. Every single time that abortion has been on the ballot in any state, red or blue, people have voted to protect abortion access. Overwhelmingly, Americans agree on protecting abortion access. So we can say men, we can say women, we can say whatever, but realistically, as a whole, society is pro-choice. And when it comes to whether or not men should have opinions, sure, you can have an opinion, but that opinion shouldn't impede somebody else's ability to choose.
We can play the statistics game all day long. I think we played that earlier. There are also recent studies that have come out since Roe v. Wade was overturned with the Dobbs decision that 9 in 10 voters under the age of 45 support at least some restrictions on abortion. And if you start polling young individuals about how they feel about the subject, especially in how the question is asked, there's so much more nuance to this idea that overwhelmingly everybody supports abortion. Because honestly, the better we understand pregnancy, the more our medical technology improves, the better ultrasound quality gets. It is irrefutable to know that you are looking at a human being in the process. Heck, you can go in for a 6-7 week ultrasound today and hear your baby's heartbeat in real time, which is an incredible development that never could have been part of the conversation in, say, 1973 when Roe v. Wade was decided. So I don't really see the reality that America is overwhelmingly in favor of abortion. That's just not proven based on the statistical analysis of voter patterns and where voters are coming from. That may be manifesting in certain states, but certainly when it comes to the younger generation in particular, I don't see that trend happening.
Go ahead, and then I have a question for you.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out, so you have to recognize and really dive into the way that these surveys and studies are done. Because when you say like, oh, the majority of people think that there should be some limitations on abortion, correct, but those limitations are things like, past the 3rd trimester and things like that. So yeah, a lot of people are like, oh, we should do this responsibly. We should try to protect both people involved. And so you can't make an overarching assumption like, oh, most people think there should be restrictions, but then go ahead and promote something like a 6-week abortion ban, which is not what most people agree with. There's nuance there. And there has to be recognition that over 90% of abortions happen before week 13. And most people oppose or want to have some variability of restrictions on the 3rd term or third term abortions, but that's only 1% of abortions that occur. And we can go
Which is about 10,000 to 15,000 babies per year.
Right. And so we can go into it. So they've done studies, no, we love these, on that 1%. Who is that 1%? And overwhelmingly, it is people who have medical conditions directly related or indirectly related to their pregnancy, and ending the pregnancy is going to save their life or save them from irreversible harm. Number 2, victims of domestic violence. Number 3, people who already have children who live in states with bans, so they have limited access to finances and time that allows them to seek out an abortion out of state where it is accessible, leading them to have that termination later in their pregnancy than they would have if it was available in their state. And so, number 1, it's 1%. If we want to demonize this 1%, you also have to recognize that this 1% are already in an impossibly vulnerable scenario. And I don't think that it's correct to, 1, focus in on such a small percentage, and then 2, realize that they are vulnerable people and that they are the target of our demonization.
So I certainly don't intend to demonize any part of this situation whatsoever. I do think it's important for us to be accurate and precise. That 1% seems like an astronomically small number in this scenario, but we are talking about up to 15,000 children every year who are aborted after 20 weeks gestational age. So we're talking well into the 3rd trimester in many of these circumstances. Interestingly, the research arm of Planned Parenthood, the nation's largest abortion provider, the Guttmacher Institute, recently did a whole survey on who is obtaining abortions after 20 weeks. I certainly trust Planned Parenthood's own research arm to tell us the reality of who is seeking abortions after 20 weeks as the nation's leading abortion provider. And they found that the reasons were not at all different from women who are seeking abortions throughout the 1st and 2nd trimester. They often use this label of medical necessity or a medical condition that women are dealing with. But interestingly, that's labeled often through insurance purposes and in medical clinical settings as anything pertaining to the physical or mental health of the mother. So often you're looking at financial strain, you're looking at certain situations and circumstances in her life that she may be dealing with hardship surrounding. But in no way, shape, or form is that necessarily a life-saving medical intervention to stop the imminent death of the mother, which I think is often the conversation that we're seeing in the mainstream media and in presidential debates and in all these conversations, really medical intervention, medical exemptions for the life of the mother is a whole broad range that can honestly apply to any circumstance depending on who your physician is.
So, in regards to the topic of third trimester abortions, what are your thoughts on just early induction versus dismemberment of a baby? Because a baby who is
Great
born in
question.
the third trimester has to be dismembered. So, why not just early induction in those particular extreme circumstances?
Yeah, fantastic question. Go ahead.
Yeah. So, absolutely. And this is based on individual circumstances, right? Because as I said before, a lot of these happen because of medical conditions, whether it's the mother or the fetus themselves have a congenital abnormality or something that was caught later in the pregnancy. And so if we're able to birth that child, and if they are at the limit of viability, so usually at least 23, 24 weeks or so, that can absolutely be a conversation. But I also think that it is demonizing to both pregnant people and physicians in the medical community as a whole to assume that that conversation isn't already happening, because it is. When people find themselves in these scenarios, physicians aren't being like, oh, well, gotta chop it up. Like that's just not the conversation that's happening at all. The conversation is very complex and very individual and very nuanced. And physicians in this sector have a very compassionate understanding of the experience of the pregnant person, and they offer everything that's available. They're like, here, this is the scenario we find ourselves in, and these are the options that we have. And that's when I decide for myself what is best for my individual, life and body. And that's why I'm pro-choice, because sure, we can say it, if we paint it in a certain way, we can make it seem as though it's an evil thing that people are they just don't care about life, right? But I think that that's inherently demonizing to women to feel as if we don't value the lives inside of us, and that we reach the third trimester and all of a sudden we're like, you know what, I don't care. Because that's not what's happening at all. And that's not, from the physician's perspective either, what's happening.
I'm really glad that you brought this question up the way you did, because I think most people in these circumstances don't really know what we're talking about when we're talking about a surgical abortion procedure. In fact, the average American who's very passionate about the subject might not even know what an abortion actually is. So when we're talking about a third trimester abortion, we're talking about, first and foremost, intentionally ending the life of the child that is otherwise thriving and growing inside of you. And that typically involves an injection of a chemical called digoxin, a pharmaceutical that's often used for cardiac situations, to induce cardiac arrest in the baby and make sure that child is no longer surviving. Then they will induce essentially labor, although at that point your child has already passed away. And in the process, it more often than not does involve dismemberment of the actual child. And I know this is incredibly hard to talk about and incredibly hard to hear, but I think we should be intellectually honest about what we are calling life-saving reproductive health care. Because interestingly, this always, always, always puts the life and the health of the mother who is laying on the surgical operating table at risk as well. In the process of dismembering a leg or an arm or a head from a neck of your child, which is traumatic and horrifying, but is reality. Often women have perforated uteruses, their cervix can be torn in the process, women bleed out on the table quite often, especially at facilities like Planned Parenthood, where often ambulances are called to bring women to the emergency room in these circumstances. But tragically, we have no such thing in America as a mandatory reporting law surrounding abortion like every other developed Western country has. So I can't tell you the exact number of women who have died from these type of abortion procedures, but we do know that in the last several decades, well over 100 women have died from these procedures. So it is incredibly traumatic and in no way, shape, or form doing no harm, which is what physicians swear to do when they graduate from medical school by taking the Hippocratic Oath. It is in fact doing grave harm by ending the life of an individual who otherwise would survive if natural induction were allowed to happen and this baby were born. And we treat these as two separate patients who deserve all of the life-saving intervention possible in their medical care. It is doing harm both to that child, but also inherently to the mother who has to live with that physical trauma, emotional and mental trauma, for the rest of her life, and certainly may even have her physical life put at risk as well in the process. So ultimately, if you ask a really good OBGYN who is incredibly skilled at their job, they would tell you that particularly in the third trimester, when a baby is clearly past the point point of viability, which keeps getting better every single day because we have better medical technology and intervention. So babies are surviving at 20, 21 weeks now, which is phenomenally interesting. A good OBGYN would tell you that there is so much more danger to induce a pregnancy artificially by doing the digoxin injection and then dismembering your child rather than delivering the baby and then treating this as two separate patients.
Yeah, so I really want to harp on your emphasis of the complications because statistically, abortions have about the same complication rate as simple dental procedures. So, sure, we can talk about a couple of women who had extreme complications, and usually when they have complications from the abortion, it's because they were already having medical complications that led to that abortion. So, these are very nuanced and these are complex medical scenarios, and it is so easy to describe these procedures and describe this as a very barbaric thing without recognizing the context. Because people who find themselves in this scenario are making one of the hardest decisions they will ever have to make in their entire life. And usually they are very limited options and they are led to this position or they are led to this option because it is one of the only options. And the complication rates are very minimal and very far between. And so, yes, we should recognize that fetuses should be protected. But again, at the same time, if you are choosing to protect a fetus over the life of the woman, then you are choosing to be indifferent to the suffering of pregnant people. And it's interesting because you mentioned how, there are circumstances where abortions are allowed because, in circumstances where we need to protect the life of the mother. And I think it is so interesting to realize that women have to be on death's door in order to be granted care. And I think that is so wrong because, we're scared of women dying from pregnancy as we should be. But for every one pregnancy related death, there's about 80 women or 80 people who have severe lifelong or even just long-term complications from that pregnancy. So it's so much more than just death that is the risk. It is the entire bodily alteration that pregnancy does and all of the complications that come with it. And we need to recognize that you are allowed to say, I don't want my health to be at risk. And it doesn't mean just dying. It means developing lifelong conditions. It means having complete bodily alteration. Women should be able to make that choice and be like, that is something that I do not want for my body and my life.
Let's come back to the on death's door thing because there's a great example going pretty viral on all of that in the last couple of weeks with a beautiful young woman named Amber Thurman. And I would love to get your take on that. But I guess my biggest question is, when are women expected to consent to pregnancy? If this is all about altering your body and all of the suffering and the complications you're going to go through with pregnancy, which also isn't telling the whole story, right? A baby within you actually nourishes your immune system. They provide stem cells back into your immune system in a symbiotic relationship. Your blood starts pumping natural steroids when you're pregnant, which is fascinating. I have lupus, for example, an autoimmune disease, and women who have lupus who are pregnant typically fare so much better because their body is producing natural steroids and their baby is helping their immune system survive too, which is fascinating. But so it's not all suffering and doom and gloom and negative alteration of your body. There's a lot of beautiful things that accommodate that as well. But when are women supposed to reasonably consent to this idea of being pregnant and the experience of being pregnant?
Yeah, so you can consent to the pregnancy when you find out you're pregnant. So within the time that you find out you're pregnant or, the short window, thereafter, that is when you are deciding whether or not you consent to carrying that pregnancy.
How about engaging in the behavior that will always inevitably be the only thing that leads to conception of a child?
No, because people partake in sexual activity for far more reasons than just procreation. People have, partake in sexual activity for social connection, for bonding with their partner, for stress relief. It's so much more than just procreation. So by saying that, oh, you consent to pregnancy by consenting to sexual activity, that's dehumanizing sexual activity because animals only procreate or only have sex to procreate, right? Some animals do it for some social interaction, but few and far between. So that is a fairly uniquely human thing for it to be more than just to make children. And so by restricting people's ability or respect towards their sexual activity, you're dehumanizing them. You're saying that you are nothing more than an incubator. Sex serves you nothing more than just to make children. And so if you're not intending to make children, then you just shouldn't do it.
Actually, no, I think sex is pretty great. We're all married. I think it's something that we should be celebrating. And often that's not talked about in the context of this conversation. It absolutely does exist for the purpose of emotional bonding with your significant other, your partner. But there is only one circumstance in which life is conceived, and it is through heterosexual sex. If we want to be really clear and cut about it, it's through penis and vagina sex, period, full stop. Heck, we have to go out of our way in medical settings to prevent that from happening by inventing infinite forms of contraception, of birth control, because we know that that is the only engagement of activity that will ever result in the creation of human life. So I do think it's interesting that we talk about consent to pregnancy as waiting to find out when you are pregnant, which typically happens 6 to 8 weeks into your pregnancy, well after you've engaged in the sex to begin with. Because if anything, I think it's really dehumanizing to suggest that women don't have jurisdiction over the choice to have sex, to realize I don't have to do this if I'm not ready to be a parent. I often hear people say on college campuses or in feminist debates and stuff that we talk about this, saying that you have a right to sex, that nobody can take that away from you, that sex is consequence free and doesn't always result in any of these things. Any action for any human being does involve consequences, good and bad. I would say conception is a beautifully good consequence of having sex, and it doesn't occur 100% of the time. But to suggest that we have no control over saying, you know, I'm not really ready to be a parent, I'm going to have sex anyway, and consequences be damned, isn't that more dehumanizing than saying we have jurisdiction over our decisions?
No, because women should be able to choose whether or not they have sex for a variety of reasons. It's not just procreation. And I also just want to ask you, based on this conversation, how do you feel about abortion exceptions in the case of rape?
I'm very glad we're talking about this. It's probably going to be its own whole conversation here for a little while, but I'm not in support of them for various reasons, and I'm excited to get into that. But we're also talking about 1% of all abortions that are obtained in America happen from rape victims. About 0.5% of all abortions happening in America are from victims of incest, and a very similar comparable number are for the life of the mother conversation or fetal abnormality, which often includes things like Down syndrome, which I hardly would say is a fetal abnormality, but instead is a very convenient way for us to dehumanize individuals with disabilities. So I certainly am not in favor of those exceptions. I realize that's not the mainstream position to take in America today, but all of these states, with very few exceptions, maybe one off the top of my head, do include those exceptions. In states like Florida, where I live right now, for example, there are exceptions for rape, incest, life of the mother, and fetal abnormality. So that is the status quo in America.
Okay, that's interesting. I just like to get people's baseline, because it seems, based off of that answer, that women who are assaulted should then, which means they've already have their autonomy stripped away from them. Their bodies have already been used against their will. And then a pregnancy results from that, then you are saying you're just compounding it, right? You're saying your body is actually continuing to not be your own. It is continuing to be used without your consent. And I just think that's a really interesting hill to stand on.
You know, interesting that you say compounding trauma, because I would say that the exact opposite is true, that if we truly care about a victim of a horrifying situation of sexual assault, rape, incest, etc., which is already illegal in this country, certainly is not punished to the degree that it should be. And if you ask any pro-life activist about this conversation, we would say rapists should probably be castrated in America and should receive much harsher prison sentences, rather than here in California, where they're often let out of prison much earlier than their sentence is accommodating for, to make room in prison, which is just crazy. If you look at a picture of two individuals, one who was conceived in a loving consensual relationship and one who was conceived in rape, you're looking at a human being either way. So you're talking about a third-party bystander that is receiving the death penalty for the heinous, atrocious criminal act of a horrifying individual who deserves to be punished, but this individual doesn't. And when we're talking about compounding trauma for the mother, abortion is, in some studies, Denmark, for example, which does have a mandatory reporting law, unlike the United States, proven to be 6 times more likely to cause a woman to seek out suicide in her lifetime. It is incredibly linked to higher levels of anxiety, depression, substance abuse, mental health issues across the board. So when I'm looking at a victim of a horrifying crime like rape, having autonomy stripped away, having jurisdiction stripped away, and feeling used in the process, I would never want to add more trauma to that young woman's life, to make her more likely to be anxious and depressed, to make her more likely to be addicted to substances, to make her 6 times more likely to seek out suicide in her lifetime. In no way, shape, or form is that empowering either to the child who's receiving the death penalty for the decisions of someone else, a horrible actor who deserves to be punished, or, of course, to the mother.
Yeah, so you mentioned statistics from Denmark, but I'll mention statistics from the United States where we live. So they followed 700 women for 3 years, and after that, who had abortions. And after that 3 years, 95% did not regret their decision in any way. And the 5% that did regret their decision didn't regret the abortion itself, they regretted the circumstances that led to the abortion. And then they've also done studies in the United States where we live, where they've followed women who've had abortions and followed women who had births. And they found that women who gave birth were about 2 times more likely to develop mental health conditions after giving birth compared to people who had abortions. And what they did to sort of make sure that this was accurate is they not only looked at whether or not you developed something after your abortion or your birth, but they looked at your mental health conditions prior to that pregnancy. So did you already have depression? Did you already have anxiety? Did you already have an inpatient admission to like a mental health institution, something like that? And they found that women who had abortions before the pregnancy and after the abortion had the same amount of mental health conditions as before and after, where women who gave birth actually had more after than they did before. So to your point, I think that we want to protect women. We want to make sure that we are not compounding this trauma. And pregnancy, as I'm sure you can speak to, can be a very impactful and sometimes traumatic experience to your body. It can also be very rewarding and very, amazing, but it depends on the person and it depends on the circumstance, which is why everyone should have a choice. And the last thing I just want to mention is your language that you use, and I just point this out because I think it speaks to perspective, is when we talk about the result of rape, right? Like this child who is a result of rape, and you say that they deserve protection and it is not their fault. True, but nowhere in there did you really recognize that person's experience, their mother's experience, right?
Oh, certainly
Because
I did.
by prioritizing the product of conception, by prioritizing a fetus and the child thereafter, you are indifferent to the woman and their experience in pregnancy and through birth.
In no way, shape, or form am I indifferent to the suffering of women who've experienced this type of thing. And ultimately, as I said before, it is a heinous, horrific act in society that is honestly the remnants of a rape culture that I think is often talked about in the United States today from a feminist perspective that needs to be more harshly punished because there is no greater violation to a woman's autonomy than sexual assault and rape. My heart absolutely breaks for individuals who have had to endure this circumstance. That's not prioritizing the products of conception, in other words, the child that has been conceived through this process. Rather, it's admitting that there are multiple parties involved in the traumatic after effect of what that decision from a horrible criminal individual has created a ripple effect for the next generation. So we're talking about multiple parties involved here who have the trauma to deal with moving forward, not just the child, not just the mother.
Okay, question for you, and then I have a question for you. Is it possible, you're speaking about adding trauma on trauma for someone who is a rape victim. Is it possible that it might be different for everyone? That's for someone who has an abortion after rape, that might be the more traumatic choice, whereas someone who chooses to keep the child, that could be the more traumatic choice. Is that possible?
Certainly, trauma is a lived experience, right? So if you ask different individuals, they're going to give you different answers a few years out, 20 years out, whatever. Interestingly, there was a different study that followed women much, much later after abortion that found the exact opposite. 10, 20, 30 years down the line, abortion regret is a very, very real thing in this country that you're not allowed to talk about because it doesn't follow the mainstream narrative. But when we're looking at trauma, I think it's important for us to be intellectually honest about what we're talking about here when it comes to abortion. You talked about the difference between a woman giving birth and a woman seeking an abortion. What happens in an abortion? Does the baby just poof? I mean, genuine question. You're a doctor. Tell me what happens in an abortion.
Yeah, so the majority of them, 90+%, are going to be medication abortions. So essentially what happens is there's 2 different medications, which one of them might no longer be accessible, and that's a whole different conversation. But essentially there's 2 medications that you take, and they open the cervix. So they ripen the cervix, which the cervix is the opening of your uterus. So your uterus is kind of like a muscular pocket, and then the cervix is the entrance and exit of it, which typically it's closed. It can open a little bit when you have your period, right? Because it is shedding the lining of your uterus. So if you think of an abortion as similar to a period, we are sort of inducing a period. So especially in 90+% where it is a non-viable fetus. It is very small amounts of products of conception. There is not an actual viable fetus there yet in 90+%. And so we use medication abortion. So it's 2 different pills. Like I said, one is going to ripen the cervix, open the opening, and then the other one is going, and they kind of work in a duality, but the other one is going to help the lining of the uterus shed, which usually the fetus is implanted into the lining of the uterus. So when you shed that lining, very similar from a period, and then you release the uterine lining as well as anything that's attached to it.
Okay, so that's kind of true. The first pill being mifepristone and the second being misoprostol. The first pill does more than just open the lining of your cervix, open the opening to your cervix to allow for expulsion of the baby. It actually cuts off nutrients that are keeping that baby sustained and alive in its mother's womb. So you are starving the baby to death. You are cutting off progesterone to the baby through the gestational sac or the placenta, depending on how far along you're talking about this. And then the second pill, misoprostol, allows for expulsion of that baby. In other words, you are looking at a vaginal delivery of a child, even if it is a very, very small child, that more likely than not is happening in your bathroom when you're sitting over the toilet or you're sitting in a bathtub. When women obtain medication abortions early on in pregnancy, some examples of this being related to rape, although less than 1% of all abortions obtained in America are because of a rape victim seeking an abortion. So this is more often than not women choosing this for convenience opportunity. They don't want to have a child. They don't feel prepared to have a child. They weren't prepared to bring a child into the world after they consented to sex. You're looking at a vaginal delivery of a child, be it what you would expect delivery, birth to look like, or not. And women who show up at Planned Parenthood, for example, the nation's largest abortion provider, and are confirmed to be pregnant and sent home with the abortion pill, are forced to swallow the first pill while they are sitting in the clinic to make sure that they are taking the regimen correctly. They're then sent home for a few days to then take misoprostol, and they are told this is like taking a heavy Tylenol more often than not. The Washington Post did a fascinating expose on this a few years ago, and even as an overwhelmingly pro-abortion source, told really honest stories of what women who were told this is just going to be like a heavy period, this is just going to be like taking a Tylenol, actually experienced in their bathroom. Not only is it not a pain reliever in any way, shape, or form, it causes significant pain physically, emotionally, mentally to women. They were not prepared to see a fetus expelled into their toilet or into their bathtub. And there are harrowing stories in this article, I highly encourage you to read it, of women who catch their child in their hand, who have to then be told to flush it down the toilet, who watch it drain down the bathroom drain, because they are looking at a child when instead they were told this is going to be like a heavy period. That's a really traumatic, if we want to use the language of the abortion industry, forced birth that was not going to naturally take place at that stage in fetal gestation. It certainly is an image that that person is going to deal with for the rest of their life. Now, someone can say that was traumatic for me or not, but why would we ever want to put women who've already been through difficult circumstances through obtaining that image and having to live with it for the rest of their life?
Well, I have another question unless you want to respond to that real quick.
I would love to respond to at least a part of it. So now, number one, just talking about we're saying that we starve the fetus to death.
You cut off progesterone. You cut off the gestational
and that's what I was saying as far as shedding the uterine lining, because the fetus is attached to the uterine lining. The uterine lining is where you have the placenta, the blood flow. The blood flow is what nourishes. They don't get food, they get blood flow, and that is how they are nourished, through the nutrients in blood. And so when you shed the uterine lining, you are simply cutting off their access to maternal blood flow, and that is shedding the uterine lining. So I just think it is really interesting terminology to say we are starving them to death when
cutting off their nutrients, perhaps.
Right, cutting off their nutrients, accurate. And yes, and exactly. And then you also say forced birth, but we use the word forced in different ways. You use the word forced to allude to medical induction, where I use the word forced when I say forced pregnancy to allude to pregnancies that are non-consensual. So just to recognize the difference in the terminology that we're both using.
Yeah, I just think it's important to be realistic and to be honest with women that when they're obtaining an abortion, it's not just a wave a magic wand, poof, all of a sudden everything is going away. This is a process of expulsion of a baby naturally through actual birth or through artificial induction after that child has stopped receiving their nutrients. We can call that whatever we want to, but essentially is no longer living, either through an injection of something to stop their heart or through stopping the flow of nutrients naturally to that child in the womb. It's still a vaginal delivery either way. And that's either going to happen by seeing your child in the palm of your hand or in your toilet or in your bathtub, which is a horrifying reality that literally millions of women deal with every year. And we're still told it's just like a heavy period. It's just like taking Tylenol, take a day off work, pour yourself a glass of wine, everything's going to be great. Or through the dismemberment of children later on in pregnancy, which you don't usually get to see with your own two eyes. That's typically shielded from the female patient involved, but is just as traumatic, if not even more so traumatic, because that's the reality we're living through.
And I just very quickly from the medical perspective, and then I would love to answer your question.
Yeah.
Women are not being told, for the majority, oh, it's just a heavy period. They relate it to a heavy period, but there is very extensive counseling that goes into the choice to have an abortion. And I think that if you want to talk about women not being adequately prepared for what they're going to experience, that's more of an issue with the pre-consultation than it is with the abortion itself. And because of these bans and restrictions on reproductive health, medical professionals are not getting appropriate, or they're limited in their training ability when it comes to consultation, when it comes to performing these abortions. And so these bans are going to negatively impact women, because also physicians aren't going to be properly trained in how to counsel. So it's a little bit more of a nuanced discussion than just, again, it's not demonizing. We can't demonize these women. We can't demonize these physicians and act as if physicians aren't properly preparing women, when there is a very extensive counseling that goes into this.
Yeah, and you're acknowledging that it's like a tough choice and a tough experience. And so proper education and how to handle it with patients is essentially what you're advocating for.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so my next question for you is there a stage in utero in which a baby in pregnancy is deserving of human rights, the right to life? Is there a stage in which you think that there should be an abortion ban, or are you through all the trimesters?
Right. So I feel like it's almost two, like whether or not I think there should be a ban, and then whether or not they should be recognized, like fetuses should be recognized in their viability and personhood. And so I'll answer both. So number one, I think that fetuses should be protected in the same way that we protect adult living humans. And we define life in an adult living human by brain function and neurocapacity. And so we should define it the same in a fetus. So when a fetus has the appropriate neurocapacity to be viable, that is essentially the limiting factor for viability. That's why the limit of viability is it's 24 weeks, but I have to be clear, because we can say, sure, some have survived at 21 weeks, very, very small percentage. And 24 weeks is realistically when about 50% are going to be able to survive. These are individual, these are very unique, complicated circumstances. But that limit of viability, the limit is based on neurological function. And that's also the same way that we define life in adults. So I think that we just have to be consistent across the board and define life in the same way. We do not define a adult's life ending when their heart stops. We define it based when their brain is no longer functioning and they have been lost as a person. Your personhood lives here. And so it should be defined the same in a fetus. And then when it comes to bans, I personally am opposed to all bans, but that is because, as I mentioned before, these abortions in later gestation are a very small percentage, and it's usually people who find themselves in an impossible choice based on medical circumstances, life circumstances, domestic violence, what have you. And so for me, in my personal opinion, I feel like if we were to oppose a ban on, say, only abortions past 21 weeks or what have you, from the fetal perspective, that would make sense. But then I think you're also ignoring and becoming indifferent to the circumstances of the pregnant people. And I don't think it's appropriate to further demonize and compound trauma on people who are already in difficult decisions.
Okay, before you reply, I want to ask one more little question, and then you can reply to the full thing.
Mm-hmm.
So do you agree or disagree with the statement that there's no medical necessity for abortion after viability, that you can just do early induction? What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's very unique. It's very dependent on the individual. Yeah.
So it doesn't it sounds like it's what you're saying is that it's a want, not it's a desire, not a need. Is it a need? Is it ever a need to dismember a baby after viability rather than just doing an early induction?
Yeah, so that's also based on the sort of the strategy of the procedure. But I think it is a need if there's a medical necessity, right? So if the pregnant person is suffering or the fetus is suffering from a medical condition, then it is necessary.
So it's necessary to, I just want to, because I think this is such a fascinating topic that I think so many people are confused about or unsure of what's what. And I did an entire episode with medical professionals on if abortion is ever medically necessary. So we went in depth on this topic and I find it really fascinating. So when you're saying a need, I'm just not clear, like when would there be a need? It's very confusing to me why we would ever need to dismember the baby in utero rather than just early induction. There's like, I'm not hearing ever an example where that's ever necessary. So I'm just trying to get an understanding of what you think about that.
Yeah, and that's a fair question. And so I don't, in my personal opinion, I don't think that there's necessarily a requirement to dismember, right? Or to go through with fetal termination. But it really just depends on whether or not, so this is where this later in gestation sort of conversation can get sticky, because I'm not saying that you need to agree with me, because I think as my experience in medicine, I have sort of a heightened sense of compassion and need for autonomy, because I see all of these patients in scenarios that I could never fathom. And so I have a very hard time stamping my personal approval on banning or even on passing judgment on people who are in these impossible circumstances. Now, when we frame it in a sense of, it is very traumatic, it is barbaric, but we also have to recognize the complex circumstances that lead to that procedure. And I agree with you that there is a possibility that there could just be an induced labor. And I do believe that in these circumstances, that is discussed with the families.
Right. So then basically it comes down to if they want to care for that child after the baby is born or not. That's all it really comes down to. It sounds like.
Yes. Or yes.
And so just to understand your stance, you're okay with someone after viability to kill that child because they don't want to take care of that child, essentially, for any reason, whether it's medical, like emotional issue or domestic violence, or there's a fetal abnormality that they didn't catch till later. Any of those extreme regions, which you're explaining, are very rare. And obviously this doesn't happen very often, but you're okay with it. They make the choice. Like, I'd rather the child, like to kill the child rather than just early delivery and give the baby up for adoption, for example.
Yeah, no, not necessarily, actually. Like when it comes to, and I want to emphasize safety when it comes to from a medical perspective or a social perspective. So I mentioned like domestic violence and things like this. So if that person not necessarily just doesn't want to carry the pregnancy, that would be a different scenario. And that's where I could potentially see limitations existing. I think that is valid. I think that if the pregnant person has a concern about their own safety or the safety of the child during or after birth, so say if they're in a domestic violence situation or something, which happens very often, it's not super rare, if they believe that pregnancy, because women are also 3 times more likely to be killed by their partner if they are pregnant compared to if they are not pregnant. And so actively being pregnant puts a target on women. So this is why it's so difficult, because I don't believe, yes, you should be able, if we want to put it in some of the terms that y'all are using, like, I don't think that you should be able to dismember your baby just because you don't want to be pregnant. If that's the scenario, then like, no, not necessarily. I would not personally agree with that. But in reality, a lot of it comes down to more, it's not that I don't just want to be pregnant, it's that this pregnancy is unsafe for me, whether it be medically or circumstantially.
Got it. Okay, go ahead.
I think that fails to address so much of the underlying issues that you continue to bring up related to financial struggle and hardship, domestic violence, potentially unsafe situations at home. Why wouldn't we go out of our way to help parenthood be more affordable, to help women be able to pay their mortgage and be able to care for this child, to help women put their children up for adoption if that's what they end up choosing, place them with an adoptive family, and domestic violence? It just seems to me to be an incredibly traumatic quick fix to help women avoid these horrible situations, which we're not really helping them escape. If they're living through a domestic violence situation and they're 9 months pregnant and we help them end the life of their child because they're afraid for their safety, they're still not escaping the domestic violence situation they find themselves in. So I just find it interesting that abortion is prescribed, especially in what you are describing as a barbaric abortion in the 3rd trimester, as the solution to all of these societal ailments that women are dealing with.
Yeah, so I don't believe that it is prescribed as a solution. And I think that, again, the desire to hone in on the 1% is what skews this conversation, because I personally would like to focus on the 90+%, not to say that the 1% is insignificant, because it's not. But when it comes to people's public opinion, when it comes to laws that are passed in our country, we need to recognize the majority of people that this affects, not just the 1%. If in states that were passing abortion bans, they were passing 21-week bans, I don't believe there would be this public outcry and this, worry and this pushback on it, because people would be like, you know what, like that is understandable. And that should also be, there should be exceptions for me personally, like rape, incest, medical conditions, things like that. But that's not something I would have a problem with necessarily. And I think that that's not what we're talking about, right? Most of these states that are passing bans, they're passing 6-week, 12-week bans where we're not even close to the limit of viability. There is no dismemberment. It's medical abortion. It's very, very different for 90+% of the abortions that occur.
Okay, you go ahead and respond. And then I have a couple other questions to ask before we finish out this conversation.
So let's talk about the 90%. You said earlier that 90+% of abortions are happening before 10 weeks gestational age.
13 weeks.
13 weeks. Okay, so let's say a state is passing one of these 12, 13-week abortion bans, which some are into that stage, that do include these exceptions of rape, incest, life of the mother, fetal abnormality, which every single state that has passed abortion restriction laws, except for one, accommodate for all 4 of those categories. Is that something you'd be comfortable with? Because now we're talking about 90% of abortions, 97 really, if we're talking about women who seek abortion early, typically because of the fact that they just don't want to be pregnant.
Yeah, it's something that I would be more personally comfortable with, but professionally hesitant about, because the Texas abortion ban has actually been proven. There's a study posted in JAMA that showed that after Texas's abortion ban, their maternal mortality rate, so women dying due to pregnancy-related causes, increased by 56%. Nationally, it increased by 11% because of pandemic and different reasons. So it shows that the laws that are in place in Texas specifically, and this has been shown in other states, but more drastically in Texas, it does lead to increased harm against pregnant people.
Well, you can explain that in a million different ways, right? Thousands more women are giving birth naturally to their children later on versus seeking abortions earlier on. The sampling pool literally changed after the Texas heartbeat law did pass.
If you look at the study, they controlled for all of those factors, and they found that it was because of limited accessibility and because of these pregnancies that led to deaths of the mother.
So personally, you are in favor of certain restrictions being placed on abortion. There are certain circumstances in which abortion makes you uncomfortable and you don't think should be legal. But professionally, as a physician, anything goes, essentially. If the child is wanted, it should be born. If the child is not wanted, we can do whatever you are comfortable with as the patient.
Okay, finish out your answer, and then we got to get to the next question and finish up the conversation.
Yeah, so I think that's an oversimplification of my stance. Personally, I would not as strongly oppose a ban later in gestation. I think that as long as you're covering 90+% from a personal perspective, I would be more comfortable, not completely agree with the ban, but more comfortable with that ban. Professionally, I recognize that pregnancy or abortions later in pregnancy, say we do a 13-week ban, you are then targeting an already vulnerable population. And so from a professional perspective, I would take issue with our options to help these vulnerable populations be limited, because when it comes to, exceptions for the life of the mother and things like that, these are very nuanced and complex things that are hard to write into law that ultimately impact people's medical care.
Okay. Well, I want to move on to basically the last question. I had a few more to ask you, but we're getting to the end here. Do women still have it harder in today's current Western world, or are women outpacing men? And a caveat, if you have time, is the world designed to cater to men? Sorry for all the questions.
No, it's okay. Do you want to take that one?
Sure. I certainly think it's circumstantial, depending on what we're talking about in society. In many ways, women are outpacing men. Women are seeking college degrees more. They're graduating from college quicker. They're the majority of STEM graduates, in particular, and medical school enrollees today. Women, in many ways, are more likely to be hired for the same job. Historically, women have better mental health outcomes than men, although that seems to be changing in the wake of COVID in America since 2020. So, statistically, I'm sure you could make that argument. But truthfully, I honestly believe that the feminist movement in America today is self-limiting the potential that women have for a truly progressive, enlightened, successful society. We convince women that you are better off, your life is going to be better off if you end the life of your child, for example, when you're facing financial hardship, rather than society rallying around them to make their life better, to help them pay the bills, to help them obtain free medical care, which the pro-life community is doing every day. We are convincing women it is better for feminism and more inclusive for men to be taking over women's spaces, and we applaud and cheer for these things as if it is some sort of enlightened reality, when in truth we are strategically erasing women in the process. So if anything, I think women have the capacity to outpace men in society, and in many ways are doing that, but we are self-hindering ourselves in the name of DEI, in the name of inclusivity, in the name of progressivism for the sake of progress, which I think is a really sad reality to see. And frankly, historical feminist icons likely would be appalled at the reality we're living through today.
Okay, quick answer from you too.
Yeah, so women are outpacing men, absolutely. When it comes to enrollment in colleges, the majority of medical students are women in all aspects, like or most aspects. Like we are outpacing men, and arguably it's because we've been hindered historically. And I do see it as a positive thing. I think as this whole conversation has really highlighted, our perspectives are different when we hear these rhetorics around, being a career woman versus being a mom. For me, and the way that I hear it and I recognize it, is that it's all about choice. We want women to be able to choose what is going to make them happy, find their purpose in whatever that is. And I think that is only a positive thing. It is only going to be positive for society to benefit from the contributions of women, both economically and, intellectually. And I think that by providing women the space and opportunity to make choices that might be different from what we were pressured into historically, everyone benefits.
Okay. Well, I wanted to get into the Me Too movement. I wanted to talk about beauty standards for men versus women, and we just didn't have time for it. But lastly, just round out your last statement. How does social justice play out in feminism today? Go first.
Yeah, so social justice and feminism can play out in a lot of different ways. I think particularly when it comes to reproductive rights, recognizing that women should have full autonomy over our bodies and our lives, and that is the core tenet of feminism as a whole. And it should also be, which I'm happy that we agree on things like, we should increase the availability and affordability of our families. We should be supporting women and creating these villages, because if a lot of women want to be moms and they want to have these communities, and our society is a very individualistic society. And so I feel like we should be encouraging women to create these villages. We should be encouraging men and everybody to help create these villages and sustain these villages and have these more close connected communities. And I think that's what feminism is. And, when it comes to the actual idea of social justice and feminism, it's so overarching and it's so broad. But particularly, I think it's mostly about just reaching for equality, both in, legal equality, which we've thankfully reached for the most part, but also in, fighting against stigma.
Social justice is a term that's been often politicized, especially in the more recent years of American politics, but is a term that I loved growing up with in Catholic education in particular, because it speaks to serving the people around you in a selfless and meaningful way to bring purpose back to society. And it's frustrating to me, I think, to see social justice be perverted in the last several years to honestly give women the short end of the stick way more often than not, to convince us that the things that are going to bring us joy are actually going to tear us down, to convince us that the best decisions we'll make for our lives are inherently selfish and self-motivated, rather than perpetuating more social justice and bringing service back to our communities at large. But ultimately, I think this entire conversation about feminism and women's empowerment and true equality in society comes down to truth. And in many ways, we are devoiding society of truth because we are sheltering individuals from hearing it. There's the old casual line from the legal movies, you can't handle the truth. And behind me on my show every day, I have a big neon sign that says you can handle the truth, because I think women deserve it. I think women deserve the opportunity to have informed consent about what an abortion procedure really is. I think women deserve the opportunity to have truly women's spaces designed for them and to confront the truth that there are many men trying to infiltrate those spaces today. I think women deserve the opportunity to pursue their dreams, but also to pursue marriage and motherhood, which truly is going to bring them statistically more purpose, satisfaction, and happiness in their life. But we seem to be dancing around this idea of what is real and what is not in the name of social justice to accommodate for strange opinions that continue popping up with every passing day. I think true justice for women involves being rooted in truth first and foremost, and I hope that more conversations like this are allowed to thrive in that process.
Amazing. Thank you guys so much. I think this might be one of my favorite conversations this season. This was so fun, and thank you so much for coming here, and we're going to end it now.